All right, thanks to everybody for showing up. This seems like a pretty good snow day, post-snow day audience. I have lectured to a smaller group of people before because if you remember, those of you who have been around a while, the last time that Villanova was inundated with blizzards, I was supposed to be giving a lecture on T.S. Eliot and Stoicism at Northwestern University, and it was snowed out, and so we had to reschedule for weeks later, and they had made a good effort to do a lot of publicity the first time around and just failed the second time. And so I think there were 4 people. There were 5 people who showed up. 1 person had to leave. So when there were 4 left, I just sat down and we talked. But there are enough of us here that maybe it's worth going through with a proper reading. This new book, it just came out in right after Christmas. Has on the back of it a blurb from a poet and a friend of mine. It says that The Violent and the Fallen is a young man's book, but one with a tradition. These are powerful poems by an author who's completely mastered the tradition. And so I thought today I would give you a reading that maybe goes some depth in explaining why it would be a young man's book, and also then considers what it would mean to have mastered a tradition. Part of one aspect of the youth of it is that the poems were sort of gathered to tell a narrative of the sort of the violence of desire and the way in which that desire can be disciplined, can be brought to order and rendered fruitful rather than destructive. My first book of poems, 4-verse letters, which is this one, it gives 4 verse epistles that are written to letters of my family. They're not really autobiographical. I made lots of things up for them because I don't like to write about myself. But they do sort of trace a narrative of querying the nature of existence and moving towards a mature perspective that in that book culminates in buying our first home and settling into our home with our first child, my wife and I. The lyrics collected in this new book sort of run quite closely parallel to that first book and are sort of like the short poems that go with the longer poems in the first book. And the first poem I'd like to read for you today is one that I think captures the painful and awkward violence of desire that tends to be manifested in, say, teenage boys. It's a poem called The Mishawaka Cruisers, and I'll preface this just a little bit. Twice in my life, I have been driving through a small town, once in my early childhood in Salina, Ohio, and then later in Mishawaka, Indiana, and I've suddenly been caught in a line of cruisers. You all know what it means to cruise, though nobody seems to do it anymore. I remember Christmas time in Western Ohio, sitting in the back of our car driving home from Christmas late at night, and suddenly there were glaring lights everywhere, and I looked up. I suppose I was supposed to be sleeping, and my dad had inadvertently got us locked into a caravan of cruisers through a small town who were just driving slowly around 2 blocks of I think it was Van Wert, Ohio. I managed to do the same thing years later, and so I wrote this poem, The Mishawaka Cruisers. All wiry and cavern-chested, voices of rubber bands and spokes off bicycles, the boys out late on West McKinley Ave are waiting, talking, searching through the night. Their midnight blue mess jerseys are the fields on which blank, luminous 15s appear in answer to the strokes of passing headlights. A line of weekend cruisers, mufflers loose and loud with bragging, makes its measured circuit along 3 blocks of neon fast food chains, the darkened panes of auto dealerships, the checks cashed in the boarded dollar store. A high-perched floodlight bathes in blinding milk a fleet of new sedans and minivans beyond the cyclone fence. It's summer now, and light lives leaping in conic clouds of gnats. 3 boys follow my car as it gets trapped within the caravan, I settling for my mute impatience in lieu of the hope of spying an unknown batch of girls with beer. Their betters park mud-speckled muscle cars and perch blunt, certain bodies on the hoods. But these 3 wait with long legs, hairless, stretching, poked between high tops and jean shorts. Above us, the sky opens into sweeping plains that neither field nor parking lot, nor studded along the row of burning signs could penetrate or fruitify. The sky is just an empty clearing for the heat. And though these boys' hearts pound with wanton weakness, and though cars fill the street with chrome and order, I catch the vacant boredom just beneath. Just then, a gap forms as two girls hop out from a green pickup's cab to join the crowd. And I escape, turn right off the main drag. Their eyes pursue my fenders, then turn back in search of something worth the endless waiting. I have a place to go, someone to meet, but in their restless still becoming rests my own dread of the bare, the incomplete. Oh, no, that's okay. I wasn't waiting. Thank you. I was wondering if there was something more I wanted to say about that poem, but I think there's not, other than maybe to say this, that it's sort of, you might say, my observation that most of us live like those teenagers, their lives of enslavement, except for perhaps those rare moments where we can sort of be lifted out of ourselves by a reason to encounter the true and the good and the beautiful. The rest of the time, we're beholden to something else, something less than ourselves. And I think of the philosopher Plotinus, who says that this flight of the self out of itself to these realities is the flight of the alone to the alone. And in fact, that it is a very lonely course, or can be anyhow, to touch upon the permanent things of reality. Especially in a world that's spends so much time denying the existence of anything permanent. So I wrote a poem a few years ago called Some Permanent Things, about precisely the reasons that one may doubt that there's anything in life other than that sort of hungry lust for power that Hobbes tells us about, but the lonely course of trying to find something permanent worth living for. The retail banker in his cubicle will speak of his great aunt, or cherished clothes he plucked from her estate sale, with some dull soporifics so quaint they can't be posed. But jealous of the little powers his branch manager gives like souvenir coffee cups, he drops the sweet talk, as Acton says, corrupt, to charge this late fee or repossess that ranch. Inclined to think the salesman's smile cheap paint, the earnest confidence less pearl than swine, and every pinned lapel a scoundrel's feint, we bathe our sentiments in turpentine, suspect adultery in our neighbor's nest, leave love and faith in nursing homes to rot, where they feed on those innards we forgot, and mock our innocence for its hollow chest. But, discontented sipping irony, the occasional citizen will hear a drum sounding with more than antique vibrancy. He wanders through the alleys till he comes upon an old flag in the collective attic, too plain for casual appreciation, enduring every age's violation, its crest grown true, more bloody, and more Vatic. So I remember reading an article years ago that said that the death of poetry comes when poets tell you the forms that they're writing in, but as I'll mention later, I never would have bothered writing poems if I hadn't realized what rhyme and meter were and discovered that they were good. So I'll just tell you that that first poem was in blank verse, and this one was in a kind of ottava rima, an 8-line stanza. It's rhymed in a sort of intricate pattern. So that's a poem about the risks of cynicism and the longing for the permanent. And I think I'll read one more that's about such longing. It's called The First Sunday of Advent. It's a poem that's, in principle, I'm writing 4 poems, one for each Sunday of Advent, but I've only gotten through 2 and a half actually. So I'll read the second one later. But here's the first one. The weight of steel against the heaving rails, those strict rust parallels between the platforms where commuters stand in topcoats, mufflers, or in woolen hats, numb fingers thumbing the loose ends of gloves, expectant of the call to draw them from their winter suburbs off to the iced towers of the working daylight. We have some hope, once other hopes have failed, raised trees that have been felled, the blank cashier who answers our command for coffee and a scone. We feel the fat of idle hours, the long feline stretch of life's sabbatical. Our eyes are set towards Center City, Aloft, the southerly birds head toward an age of daylight. But when the glorious letter in the mail with words of rustling bells, when the permanent heat in the cold land. Our limbs are aching and our feet are flat, our thoughts encumbered by the gravitas of each body's weight. Our fall was hard and like no other. Will the soft wing of some other life lift us up toward daylight? I'm especially proud of that poem because I managed to make an entire stanza out of rhetorical questions in the last part. So in the early 21st century, if you can remember back that far, I spent a lot of my summers in Dublin. And I think it was in the summer of 2003, I was doing two things. One, I was living in Dublin and just beginning to read a lot of Christian Platonist mystical theology, whose highlight is what's sometimes called the apophatic, that is to say, the way in which you silence all thought in order to open yourself up to the silence and stillness of pure intellect. I was doing that, and I was also trying to get a girl to fall in love with me, and those two things combined. And so I wrote this poem in what's called the Romance 6 stanza. It's one of my favorite stanzas. It's a poem called From a Bench in St. Stephen's Green. I saw once a woman and a man turning their coffee mugs in hand, like two tense lovers pining. Formica and the seated crowd, smelling of hot beef, chattering loud, kept their arms from twining. Their eyes were wrinkled, tired with age. I'd not looked close enough to gauge their hard, serious murmur. The woman wore a pendant heart. The man showed her accounts and charts, as fits in a state lawyer. Hence, this girl on a bench with me would seem my bodied intimacy to one on a walk passing. And by my smile at her words, he'd think what I desired heard, like the sounds of undressing. Perhaps the lawyers called to bar, the strollers strolling in the park, are equal to their seeming, but in my frustrate, polite blush lingers no knowledge of her touch or satisfactory meaning. Oh, thank you. So back to this idea of this being a young man's book. Some of my early poems especially, and here's one that goes back quite a ways, are trying to capture the way in which it seems as if you're always either born too late, or if you're a child of the Midwest as I am, you're born in one place and the rest of civilization seems to be happening elsewhere. It's really one of the sorrowful things about being from Michigan. I'm immensely proud of being from Michigan now and would happily be living there. But when you're a teenager in Michigan, you tend to think that you are very far from any place that matters. And of course, I was born marvelously before the internet, and so you didn't have access, or indeed to suffer the cruel punishment of being inundated by information left and right and every day and every night. And so I recall a friend of my brother's giving me a copy of the fiction issue of the New Yorker magazine, and it was like a revelation. Here was this thick magazine with really small advertisements for things that no one I knew could afford, that seemed to just have all of contemporary culture wrapped up inside of it. So I wrote this little Shakespearean sonnet called Alone, Far from the New Yorker. It's about my first efforts to become a writer, and looking at, say, pictures of Graham Greene in his linen suit drinking martinis. A teenage boy, I'd flip its ad hen pages, its suave black columns, hoping there to learn about the world of literary sages who drank in wrinkled linen suits or turned with cigarette to meet the camera's eye as if their lives consisted of genteel suffering in the heart's urbane mystery, aborted love affairs and drunken meals. I memorized their names and read their books and tried to imitate the suited poses that lent the writing life its charmed look, a weary preference for Jameson over roses. I wrote stories, never heard, but listened for Cheever, Brennan, or White's knock at my door. So, if one way of sort of feeling outside of the world is to feel as if culture's elsewhere, there's another way of feeling outside of things, and that's what the literary critic Harold Bloom calls the experience of being belated, the sense that you've come into the world too late. All the good stories have been told already. Everything important that was supposed to happen has already happened, and it creates, in Harold Bloom's imagination anyhow, a condition of anxiety. So I wrote a poem called Their Time Up at State College, which is really supposed to be a coded reference to Michigan State, not Penn State. I had no idea I was going to move to Pennsylvania someday and State College would take on a new meaning. I wrote this poem when I was just finishing up college, I think, although I only got it right a few years ago. And so this is a poem about that experience of feeling as if you've been born too late. All the good things have already been done. It's hard to get your married brother drunk, now that you've reached the age he was once at, and he'll tell you for old time's sake how then, after a night of shots and beer, he'd toppled down a hard flight of stairs. His future wife was there. She took him in her arms and slugged him off to bed, laughing at what he slurred before, with combing fingers, held his head over the staircase rail. These two half-grown Midwestern blonde kids up at their state college, she'd let him paint a flower on her cheek that evening, right before she and the girls lit sweet cigars and found the room with booze. After he'd let his stomach settle down, they lay in the twin bed, his Kelly jersey with chipped-off number and once famous name, and her dry painted cheek upon his chest. They were young then, and aren't so old just now, and share this idly to identify a bit with you, but don't begin to drink. Your brother hasn't finished his first beer, and when you polish off your third, it seems you could never have a reckless time, a sugared time, as youthful time as they. When they surrendered the age that you are now, you lost it with them. You have none at all. No age, no wild youth to reflect on, no half-remembered smiling anecdotes, nothing to joke about or to regret. In present company, you are like them. That is, you take their lives in listening, to be as they once were or as you are. When somehow you, unlikable, shy you, manage to find someone who can match drinks, the mood turns maudlin, and you let a sigh within the quiet bar you've ended at, looking across toward this anonymous partner who can share nothing more than rounds. You hesitate, sip, and then begin to tell those stories, near but not your own, and far, quite far from any time you know. It's always fun to drink up at State College. I've never been, but so I've always heard. My brother doesn't binge as he did then, but she and him been married some years now. They actually have a kid now, one another. Can you imagine that? And me, an uncle? It makes me shake to think about it. Yeah, so many people giving birth and so much wrong with this world. I can't understand the war we're in. It's not my war, the war. So much for longing. I mentioned earlier that in my youth I had these aspirations to be a writer. I wanted to be a novelist, and in fact wrote wrote a few novels when I was young. But then one day a professor at the University of Michigan tried to teach us the basics of prosody, and I was astonished by them, by the laws of meter and rhyme. And I remember tuning out whatever it is he was trying to teach us after a few minutes and spending the rest of the class period trying to write one single line of iambic pentameter, which I will never forget because it took me so long to write it. It was a sonnet every year for 5 long years. Sonnet every year for 5. So I took that one line, which took me about an hour to compose, and then went home that night to my dorm and spent the next 4 hours writing the next 13 lines. And at the end of the night, I had written a sonnet. Sonnet about a man who goes to live in a New Jersey beach house during the Reagan administration and drink. I don't quite know what was going on there, but that's what it came to me. And the next night, I came home and wrote after class and wrote another sonnet. And I did this every night for a week. And by the end, I had 5 sonnets written. It took me, all night to do each one. But that was a good apprenticeship. And over the years, it got easier and easier until sonnets began sort of writing themselves for me. And so the morning before, 2 mornings before my wedding, I had promised my wife that I would write a poem for our wedding that would be left on the plates of all of the guests at the wedding as just part of a little gift or whatever you call it. And I woke up in the morning and sat up in bed, and I said aloud, "Though neither young nor old, nor full of wine, not blind exactly, though my sight is poor, oops, I forgot it. I crouched a beggar, waiting for a sign so obvious the dead could not ignore." So that was in my head. I went into the other room, found my notebook, wrote that down, wrote the next 10 lines, and went back to bed. And that was it. It took about 15 minutes at the most. But this is a poem for our wedding. It's called The New Life, and it's for my wife, Hillary. Though neither young nor old, nor full of wine, not blind exactly, though my sight was poor, I crouched a beggar, waiting for a sign so obvious the dead could not ignore. A flaneur, so much as is possible in a despoiled city such as this. Amid the listless crowd I casually strolled, searching for a stare not quite purposeless. A bibliographic recluse in my room, I mused what word could make me close my book. Some Old West drunk passed out by the spittoon, what patient face could cure me with a look? Then you came, sign, stare, cure, and word, and brought a new life where none was, but one was sought. Oh, thank you. Now, if Harold Bloom's right that sometimes the past can make us feel belated, as if we were born too late, and so for the whole past is a kind of oppression that makes us feel anxious and nervous and sad. I think Remy Brague, the French philosopher, has a better account of that, which is that human civilization is always filled with what he calls secondarity, that in fact we always, or at least we in the Western tradition, always stand at one remove from some primary moment. For the Romans, for instance, it was the Greeks, and that in fact this is a good thing. It enables us to know ourselves and to define ourselves in respect to something. My understanding of literary tradition, and particularly poetic tradition, is precisely that. So that sonnet there, it adheres very closely to the sort of the rigorous logic that the sonnet form allows, and in fact even uses some of the conventions of the Elizabethan sonnet, such as that repetition of sign, stare, cure, and word at the end of it. There's something really joyful about treating literature as if it were the act of moving into a room where people have lived for hundreds of years, and then you just move a chair a little bit, and that's your contribution. Right? It's just moving furniture around a very old room. And that's what this poem kind of does. It's precisely that experience of finding a way in which tradition and discipline can bring order to one's life that I meditate on in some of these poems, including the one I'd like to read for you now, which is the second Sunday of Advent poem. If marrying my wife naturally is the beginning of a new life, you really see the incarnation of that life in the having of children. And so I've written quite a few poems, maybe enough that people are going to start getting annoyed with me, about my experiences of being with my daughter, Olivia Grace, my firstborn, but she's such an apt symbol for what something like marriage makes possible, taking the sort of fickle promiscuity of our desires and ordering it to a good end and making it not simply good, but fruitful and self-diffusive. And of course, a child is a symbol of that, and in fact, the manifestation of just that self-diffusiveness of marriage. So here's the second Sunday of Advent. It's about doing the Advent calendar with Olivia. In the warm circle of lamplight, my daughter reaches up toward the pocket stitched with 8 for silver-wrapped chocolate stowed there. As I've taught her, she may eat one each night, and then each night waits for my return from work with hungry eyes. Her joy is regulated thus, a prayer, a story, and a candy. Then she cries to get but one when there are others there. St. Augustine, knowing the greed of babes for their mother's breasts was violent and abyssal, confessed that infant innocence was made more of helpless limbs than grace, less rose than thistle. My daughter takes the unwrapped sweet and chews with a slow smackerel ritual I admire. The past had little purity to lose, and we have only discipline and desire. it's probably the only poem in Western civilization that in one stanza makes an allusion to the book One of the Confessions, with Augustine's meditation on the fallenness of the human condition and the sort of hunger of babes for their mother's milk as a kind of potentially sinful desire, and couples it with a direct allusion to Winnie the Pooh, the slow smackerel, which is a word that we owe to Milne. So it probably would be the last poem to make such a coupling. But this idea of discipline and desire is one that I've returned to a number of times. And so here's another poem also featuring Livia called At the Public Pool, where the symbol of fruitful love and disciplined desire that's sort of symbolized by Livia comes into contact or juxtaposition with a symbol of a very undisciplined sort of desire, which is that for a bikini and a lifeguard. Or excuse me, a lifeguard and a bikini. Very different. The lifeguard stretches to pull off her t-shirt, unveiling the white cross taut on her breasts, the sunlight oiled in her shoulders, smothered in her hair. Two retirees take a rest beneath the picnic parasols, unbothered by supine teens on cell phones jawing at leisure. But far from all the squeals and bone-white splashes, the pastel-flowered inner tubes and swimsuits bobbing the blue glass of the public pool, my daughter watches, wades waist deep on thin shoots of legs that wobble in the kiddie pool's bright circle. A group of older children passes, skirting the lounge chairs en route to the deep beyond. But she clings tenuous to this shallow, ventures a padding palm against its surface, a reach back to the concrete edge, so she'll know where I and safety sit. I look on her face and guess that only the soft blank of sleep will bring her back the laughing recklessness lost when, a quarter hour ago, she slipped and dropped face forward through the water's plane into a silent world of light whose grip held her in thrall until undone by mine. Did she a moment feel that long caress toward which we're pulled and which we can resist? The tan bikini lifeguard stared at me, the soft dark of her thigh another lure into another kind of fatality. I clutched my daughter, but my eyes searched her and dreaded what a moment I could wish. Thank you. I thought I'd read maybe two short poems and then conclude with one somewhat longish one. Yeah, I think I'll do that. So here's one called The Gypsies. It's set on the margin of Tours, France. It was inspired by this poem by the French poet Philippe Jacotet, who speaks of sort of wandering out among some gypsies and feeling a stranger in this life. The Gypsies. There is a fire beneath the trees, its smoke threading through lumbering clouds and yellow-tipped leaves, in shades of settling night. My senses woke to madrigals tongued in the light of gypsies, their curious foreign sounds. At mid-June midnight, I see them sway before the fire, as if a brood of curious drunks who've staggered in sight of some town's decorous dances, or as if, desperate for company, they have grown cold and crouch about red coals of frantic talk, to bear the winter freeze with stories told largely by eyes and gestures. As I walk back toward town, my words, not theirs, seem as those on whom all proper shrugging doors have closed. And then here's a poem. Usually in casual conversation or in a somewhat formal occasion such as this, I always find naturally a way to mention that my in-laws are in the wine business. It's a very central and important part of our life, right on the Lake Michigan shore. They have a nice vineyard. In this book, I include, I think, two poems that are set in the vineyard. And This is one called Et in Arcadia Ego. The evergreens haunt the vineyard's margin, encircling the bare truck and backhoe mangled hill, from whose dry crests I stare across the lines of planted vines in early spring. Their dry and lightning bark like chicken feet clutching at the sky. The gravel spread out about their husks reflects in crystal gray the inchoate heat the season brings, adducing each new spray. And sour tar pearls, dulled with dust, bud on their fragile tendrils. This is a time of promise and terror, an age that snares men's wills, and holds their eyes upon the living leaf, whose veined underside is death, and on these mildewed stakes where fruit is tied to rot. I too am here, it blurts in mud, it hums along the wires, strung with notes of Pinot Noir and gargles in the fire. The cold wind cuts in from the lake, the season soon will turn, and in its humid forgetfulness, prepare a darker turn. Last spring I was out in Arizona and I was asked to come speak to a group of students at a classical charter school, and I guess they had been reading this poem the days before, and they could not figure out why I said that I too am here, the voice of death gargles in the fire, and it took me 20 minutes to explain it to them. So evidently I did some good thinking before I chose gargle. So if one of the real delights of writing poetry is precisely the way in which it enables you to sort of inhabit the past, to take the forms of the past and just move that small article of furniture around ever so slightly to create something that's new and particularly yours. There's also a great joy to be found, I think, in the way in which the form of a poem can actually guide the intellect and lead it where it couldn't have gone before. Something like that happened in the writing of this poem. Its root is, yes, yet again, somewhat Irish. Long after having returned from those summers in Dublin, in fact, having just turned down a fellowship that would have allowed me to move to Dublin and flown home from Dublin, I came back to South Bend, Indiana, and 2 days later met the girl who was going to become my wife. So it was rather fortunate that I didn't decide to move to Ireland. But then a year or two after our marriage, I had occasion to return to Dublin. And on the plane, on the flight over, I was suddenly taken by the strange realization that I could not think of a life without her in it. And by which I meant to say what would have happened had I never met you seemed an impossible and absurd act of speculation, not just because time had sealed that event in the past, but because it was just unthinkable that there would be some other mode of history. Those of you who know your Aristotle know that there's the sort of knowledge of contingent things that come to us from the senses, and then there's that necessary universal knowledge that can't be otherwise. And these two things never really meet, to put it simply. But the theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar talks about the encounter with beauty as the discovery of the inner necessity of the contingent. So that we can say with good reason, for instance, that Beethoven's Seventh Symphony could not have been written in any other way than it was, unless Beethoven had done so, had written it differently. So there's something, the contingency bears its own necessity within it. And I think that accounts for what this realization was, that what was a merely contingent event had taken on a necessity. And it seemed appropriate that I had this thought when I was flying to Dublin, which is a place where, of course, Ireland is a place where the contingencies of histories have, with much lamentation and mourning and anguish, often taken on a sort of fierce necessity of their own. So I'll finish with this poem. It's set in the Trinity Capital Hotel, which is a hotel that just overlooks the gates of Trinity College, Dublin. It's from the Trinity Capital for Hilary. Beyond the purple velvet drapes, the skeins of billowed gossamer, my hotel window looks down on the back gates of Trinity College. Up 3 floors and pierced by a late October sun, the room has been done up like a swinger's pad, with leopard print and leather, with mirrors and conic shaded lights in orbit around the dark mass of the pillowed bed. This style was once regrettable, and now all regrets are off. Tour buses crowd streets pounded once with fire from a British gunship. Wide streets once packed with bowlered clerks hastening to catch the train back to Roscommon for Easter. Two women, with whom I shared a cabin from the airport, stared out at the palms grown in front gardens, shading Georgian doors, and waited for some ginger-headed priest or pink-nosed drunk to trundle down the road. My room's a tiger of prosperity, designed by someone so assured that now the exile ship and Eucharistic Congress are past, a buried fashion can be flirted with. Someone who would never understand why the tourist from Schaumburg or Roxbury would hustle past the brushed steel of the hotel bar, off to have a pint in Wicklow, or sit down for tea and fry while sightseeing Tara. Why should the Polish maid in the corridor regret that things turned out this way, here where the sorrowed past was only so lately lost? It's 4 years now since I last saw these streets, since I decided to move home, and since I gave up on some other love, some other life, winding up in South Bend, and met you. This city's swelled with luck, and I could wish it otherwise. The vomit in the late bars and ads for XXX on pay TV that vend to hotel guests their burning passions. The fields of Ireland have always wished things had been different, or that they were now. Hillary, the mind obsessed with its own powers pretends that this or that decision, words called out to a shy woman in the dark of summer, with the river sounds, the sounds of drunken chatter and the swinging gate, might be unsaid, the rusting hinges shut unknown. There may be many things undone, about which I may think, though they'll not be, as if they were lead figures on a board subject in their position to my scrutiny. But some thoughts once said, are sacraments. They can't be unconceived or lived without. The great impossible is to unthink the path and fortune's fleet missteps that carried me on it, that brought me to you and you within my mind to dwell as the immobile real called love. Because of the odd shock, I've sometimes said, had I stayed here, I'd not have met you. But no counterfactual alternate course in time seems less real. For your actual love and being have made their print so firmly that I can neither think of a life without you, nor quite think without your presence looming up, always, your eyes beneath dark hair, your voice rising with singular certainty to greet me in the silent rooms of every city. So thank you for your time.